Hello everyone and welcome to my favorite time of year, Limited Review Week. I'm Neat Sahone and each time a set has been fully spoiled ever since my channel began 2 years ago, I have done a Limited Review Week, and today all of Amonkhet was fully spoiled. However, we are changing things up a little bit this time around. Instead of only presenting you with my picks for the best commons and uncommons in each color, I'm going to do a card-by-card review of every single card in the set, addressing each color in one video. In this video, we're going to look at every single white card in Amonkhet, and tomorrow we'll look at every single blue card, and so on. This allows me to give my initial impressions on every single card in the format, which is going to be more helpful in helping people prepare for their pre-releases and drafting the format than just talking about the best cards. If you are looking for the shorter style limited review videos I used to do on this channel, head over to the Ether Hub where you can find a video discussing my picks for the best commons and uncommons in each color. As soon as that video is available, I will put a link to it in the description. A quick disclaimer, I'm doing this review before having a chance to play with the cards, and the ratings I give them are based on my initial impressions of the format and several years of experience drafting Magic. As is usually the case, some of these cards will end up being better or worse than I expect, as it is hard to be perfect in evaluating cards if you haven't played the format yet. Down the road, I will take a look back at some of the cards I overrated and underrated, though. Before we get started, let's talk about how I'm going to be grading these cards. If you've already seen this in one of my other limited review videos for Amonkhet, feel free to skip ahead. You can find a timestamp in the description below that allows you to skip all of this introduction and get right into the card-by-card review. Additionally, for each of these cards, I'm going to say what the mana cost is and read the card before reviewing it. This is so that if you want to listen to the review without actually watching the video, say while you're driving, you can do that. Now let's look at how I'm going to be grading cards. I'm going to be using letter grades in this limited review. That is what the overwhelming majority of people voted for in a Twitter poll that I conducted. If you'd like to see a different method, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, let's go through each of these letter grades, and for each of them I'll give some examples from Kaladesh block that I would have given these grades. So as you may have expected, A is the best grade that a card can get. Well, A+ is actually, but those are few and far between. A's are cards that are so powerful that they completely shift a game in your favor, almost regardless of the board state. They are also so strong that they pull you into their colors and tempt you to find a way to splash them. They are most frequently made up of rares and mythics, though the occasional uncommon does find its way in there. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block would be cards like Herald of Anguish and Verdurous Gearhulk. These are basically the cards that you most want to open and pick in your first pack because they give your deck such a massive power boost. Next up, we have cards that receive a B. These are still great cards, but not quite as game-warping as A-level cards. This category is made up of cards that should basically always be making the cut in your deck if they're in your color. This includes premium removal and extremely efficient and powerful creatures. Cards at this grade level don't tempt you to change your entire draft the way A-level cards do, but they make the cut 100% of the time in your deck if you're in their colors. Most frequently, these are of uncommon rarity or higher, though sometimes commons get in the mix. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block are Thopter Arrest and Scrapper Champion. Next, there are C-level cards. While A's and B's are the kind of cards you're happy to first pick, C's aren't quite as exciting. They're the kind of card that basically always makes your deck if they're in your color, but aren't incredibly powerful. Here is where you find solid and efficient creatures as well as decent removal, and this is usually what the majority of your deck is actually made up of. Some examples of C-level cards from Kaladesh block are cards like Ether Swooper and Shock. Basically, these are all cards you feel good about having in your deck, but not great about taking super early. So in an ideal world, your deck will be made up entirely of cards in the A through C range. That's something to keep in mind in general as I go through cards in this list and in the other limited review videos. Cards in the D and F range are not cards you generally want in your deck. However, D cards aren't entirely terrible, but they're cards that frequently get cut from your deck and are basically just filler to help you with your curve. Generally, things have to go a little bit wrong during your draft for you to end up with more than a few D cards in your deck, as you are stretching to include every playable card you drafted if they're showing up there. Some examples of this are Ether Inspector and Reservoir Walker. Both of these cards are cards I ended up playing a few times in the format, but I was never very happy to have to do it. Generally, most decks are made up of B's and C's because A's are so rare and D's are mediocre playables that will sometimes make the cut. However, there is a grade even worse than D, obviously, and that is F. These are cards that I consider utterly unplayable and shouldn't end up in your deck for any reason. These are the cards that always seem to be the last cards you pick up in booster packs. Some recent examples of this would be Gonti's Machinations and Take Into Custody. A few more words on grading. There's some more nuance to it in many cases. I will give some cards a grade range instead of just a single letter grade because some cards are stone unplayable in some decks but become very good if your deck meets certain requirements. A good example of this from Ether Revolt is Efficient Construction. This card just gets a straight F if you have less than 5 artifacts, but if you get to 10 or more, it suddenly becomes a B. These type of nuances show up from time to time while grading cards, and I will draw your attention to them when we run into cards like it. There are also cards that aren't very good main board, but are pretty good out of the sideboard. For these cards, I will give grades based on how good I think the card would be in my main board, but also a sideboard grade that reflects how happy I am to have that card available out of my sideboard. A good example of this is Takedown, which is a D main board, but a B out of your sideboard. Now, with all that out of the way, let's start reviewing every white card in Amonkhet. Again, I will both display the card and read each card and say what its mana cost is. This is so that if you want to listen to this without having to watch the screen, you can. We're going to look at them alphabetically, so let's get started with Angel of Sanctions. Angel of Sanctions is 3 generic mana and 2 white mana for a 3/4 flyer, and it has whenever Angel of Sanctions enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until Angel of Sanctions leaves the battlefield, and it has an Embalm cost of 5 and a white. This is the first time we're seeing Embalm, so I'll explain what it does. On future cards I will not, but basically Embalm allows you to exile a creature from your graveyard. Once it's there, and in this case you pay 5 and a white mana, and then you get a token version of the creature that comes into play as a zombie in addition to its other creature types. And with Angel of Sanctions, it's obviously quite good because it has an enter the battlefield ability. But let's break this one down. For 5 mana, you get a 3/4 flyer. That's already an okay deal. You would play it in most white decks, and it would be about a C-. But this also Oblivion Rings something when it comes into play, which makes it a bomb and pushes it into the A range. Oh, it also has Embalm, as we noted, so you can get it back and exile something twice with only 1 card. That's a definite A and is one of the best first picks in the entire format, and that is without even discussing the various payoffs for Embalm and creature tokens there are in this format. If you open this, or somehow it gets past you, take it. It's pretty simple. It's great no matter what the board state is, as it will provide you with both removal and a reasonable blocker if you are behind, and removal and a good attacker in any other board state, and one that can just come back if they kill it. Next, we have Anointed Procession. 3 generic mana and 1 white for an enchantment that says if an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many tokens instead. And it pains me to say this because this was the official spoiler card for the Ether Hub, which I am a part of, and we had a lot of fun getting to spoil it, but this card isn't going to be very good in most limited decks. It takes a lot for me to like a card that costs 4 mana and doesn't do anything to affect the board immediately. You're putting yourself pretty far behind if your opponent follows it up by playing a large creature and continues to curve out. All that said, this card has the potential to be pretty sweet and limited. Things just have to go the right way during your draft. This card is a build-around, and as a result, I'm going to present a range of grades for this card, depending on what your deck looks like. I would say this card is obviously enough an F in a deck that has 0 ways of producing creature tokens. However, if you get to around 9 or 10 different ways of producing creature tokens, including creatures with Embalm, Anointed Procession probably pulls itself all the way up to a B. So an F or a B. If you get somewhere between 0 and 9 or 10, it can be a D or a C. I don't think it ever manages to get to the A level, though, mostly because Embalm also costs you a decent chunk of mana, and while getting 2 tokens for it is nice, you still aren't going to be getting the best deal ever in terms of value. This card will actually be at its best with spells that aren't Embalm, because some spells create numerous tokens instead of only 1, so if you're creating 2 tokens now you get 4, and that's a much bigger boost to power than it is with Embalm. So in the end, this card gets an F, but if you really get there on creature tokens, it is a playable card for your deck, and a quite good one in the B range. It is the kind of card that will be easy to pick up, though, if you want it, and it is the kind of card I see myself taking a flyer on near the end of packs, just in case I end up with enough ways of making creature tokens. Next, we have Anointer Priest, 1 and a white for a 1/3 human cleric, and it says whenever a creature token enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and it has Embalm for 3 and a white. A 2 mana 1/3 is what you expect, but this card comes with the Embalm ability, giving it some late game utility. It also is a payoff for the Embalm mechanic in general, as it and its embalmed form both pay you off with 1 life every time you embalm something or otherwise play a creature token. Not the biggest payoff, but certainly a relevant one. The more Embalm you get, the better this gets, but I think it maxes out around a C+ since the payoff isn't massive. I think any white deck is happy to have this 2-drop. I wouldn't take it before pick 7 or 8, though, and I think that means this card falls in the C range in most decks. Next, we have Approach of the Second Sun, which is 6 and a white for a sorcery, and it says if Approach of the Second Sun was cast from your hand, and you've cast another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach of the Second Sun into its owner's library, 7th from the top, and you gain 7 life. This card might say you win the game on it, but it is horrendous. Paying 7 mana for an effect that does nothing, I'm aware it gains you life, but that may as well be nothing when you're paying this much mana to not affect the board at all. Even in a control deck, this is too slow of a way to win you the game. How often are you going to be able to make the game last until you draw and cast Approach of the Second Sun the second time? So yeah, never play this card and you'll be better off for it. This card just gets a straight F from me. Next, we have Binding Mummy. 1 and a white for a zombie. That's a 2/2, and it says whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you may tap target artifact or creature. 2-mana 2/2s are basically always playable and limited. Sometimes even the ones with downsides, but this one comes with some upside. Being able to tap down a creature or an artifact in addition to playing a zombie is pretty nice. It isn't incredible or anything though, but being able to embalm and tap something down in addition to getting the creature token is fine. It won't really do anything unless you're planning on swinging that turn, so sometimes the text box on this card won't matter too much, but that's okay because it's still a 2-mana 2/2, one who is relevant to some degree at all stages of the game. Any white deck will play this card, especially black-white decks where you can max out on zombies, so I would give this mummy a C+. He is playable in any white deck, but not something to get too excited about in most of them. This card is a reprint from way back in Future Sight and a key card in modern Hate Bear decks. 3 mana for 2/1 with flying and flash would on its own make this card a C+, something any white deck would play, and while the card does actually have additional text on it, that text does not look to be super relevant in this format, as there is not a ton of library searching going on. Creatures with flash are always nice because your opponent often doesn't account for them, leading them sometimes into bad attacks. Imagine flashing in the Mind Sensor in to help take down a 4/2 or something, and it also adds some surprise damage to the race, especially on a creature with flying. All that said, while the Mind Sensor is a great card and an important card in Modern, it doesn't get much more than a C+ for me in this format. It is certainly a card I want in my white decks, but I would not be willing to go after him early, though if you see him near the middle of a pack, like pick 6 or later, he's a pretty solid choice. Next up, we have Cartouche of Solidarity. 1 white mana for an enchantment that is an Aura Cartouche. A Cartouche is a new enchantment type that we'll talk more about later on in this video. It doesn't actually matter much for this particular card. And Cartouche of Solidarity lets you enchant a creature you control. When Cartouche of Solidarity enters the battlefield, you get to create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance, and the creature gets +1/+1 and has first strike. Those of you who are longtime followers of my content know that I don't like auras most of the time in Limited. This is because it is far too easy to get 2 for 1. However, you may also know that I like auras that have a way of generating value that mitigates their downside, and this Cartouche does that a couple of ways. First, it makes a creature token that will go on living even if your enchanted creature doesn't. Second, it has synergy with the Trials, bouncing them when it comes into play and giving you another chance to cast them and use their useful abilities. Finally, it comes at a low enough mana cost that it doesn't kill you quite as much tempo-wise as some auras do, even if you get 2 for 1. All of this combines for me to say that this aura is actually playable. A C- though, probably, in a deck with 0 trials, but it pushes into the C+ range if you have a few trials. I would be happy picking up Cartouche of Solidarity near the middle of most packs. Next up, we have Cast Out. 3 and a white for an enchantment with flash that says, when Cast Out enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until Cast Out leaves the battlefield. It also has Cycling for 1 white. This is the first time we're seeing this mechanic, so I'll explain what it is. I won't on subsequent cards, though. So Cycling allows you to pay a cost, in this case 1 white, and then discard the card to draw a card. Cast Out is amazing. It can remove anything. Like all Oblivion Ring-like effects, this does have the downside of giving your opponent back their permanent when they blow it up. However, this also has Flash, meaning it opens the door for interacting with your opponent on their turn with the potential for Savage 2 for 1s. Also, it has Cycling, but you will basically never want to cycle this. This card is a true A in the sense that it is one of the best first picks in the format and is worth trying to splash. The flexibility to hit any permanent other than a land, the instant speed interaction, and the relatively efficient cost all line up to give this card an A-, making it the kind of card I would love to start my draft with. If you see this card, you should take it, especially because it's easy to play off of a white splash. Next, we have Compulsory Rest, which is 1 and a white for an enchantment aura, an enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature can't attack or block, okay, and then it says enchanted creature has pay 2 generic mana, sacrifice this creature, you gain 2 life. Every set needs a pacifism, and this one has an interesting design. It does the usual thing of making a creature unable to attack or block, but it also gives the option to the creature's controller of sacrificing it and gaining 2 life. So it isn't quite pacifism. That said, though, it isn't that far off. If this were an aura that attached to a creature and made it unable to attack or block, and your opponent gained 2 life, that would still be a pretty good removal spell. And this is even better than that, because at least it makes your opponent pay some mana to gain the life. Now, it is pretty bad against against creatures with Embalm, obviously, and that's, I think, what they were going for in the design here, but it's pretty good against most other creatures in this format. I think this is one of the best white commons in the set, and it comes in for me as a B-. The kind of premium removal spell you feel okay about taking early, and that you will take as many copies of if it gets passed to you. Next, we have Devoted Cropmate, 2 and a white for a 3/2, and it says you may exert Devoted Cropmate as it attacks. When you do, return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is our first time seeing exert, so I'll explain what that does, and what it allows you to do is you can choose when your creature attacks whether to make it so it won't untap during your next untap step, and you get an extra bonus for it. Here, that means bringing a creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Obviously, some creatures have insanely powerful exert abilities, and others have sort of middling ones. And I think this is a middling one. Exert is an interesting mechanic to evaluate. And looking at this mechanic, it reminds me a little bit of Revolt. Not because of how it works, but because I think the creatures who do a reasonable job on the vanilla test, but come with the extra upside of exert, are all going to be Cs or better, but those who don't do well in the vanilla test aren't very attractive. This is sort of how Revolt ended up panning out in Ether Revolt, and I think it is how exert pans out here. Luckily, this Cropmate is one of the exert creatures who does a reasonable job on the vanilla test. His exert ability isn't incredible. This is because not only do you have to make him unable to untap for a turn, but for it to even be worth it, you have to actually have a creature in your graveyard he can get back. Getting a creature back with him is pretty great, especially if you get to do it more than once. It just won't be possible all the time. In the end, I think the Cropmate is a C+, the kind of card any white deck will play, but not one to be overly excited about or go out of your way to pick in the early part of a pack. Next, we have Jeru's Resolve. 1 white mana for an instant, and it says untap target creature, prevent all damage that would be dealt to it this turn, and also has cycling too. Basically, this is a bad combat trick. Why? Because it doesn't help your smaller creature bust through larger ones, something usually required to make a combat trick a solid playable, and something aggro decks are after. Your creature has to be at least the same size as your opponent's to actually get a card out of this, meaning that a lot of the time, Jeru's Resolve isn't going to be worth a card. It does have cycling, which, without any synergies at all, makes the card a little better than it would otherwise be, because you can just throw it away anytime it's a useless card, which unfortunately is going to be most of the time. This is a card that I will run begrudgingly if I don't have enough playables, or in the event I end up with a deck with lots of cycling synergy, but most of the time this just won't make the cut for me, so I have it at a D. If your deck wants it because you were going cycling crazy, it will almost definitely wheel, so don't take it until late. Our next card is Dusk to Dawn, a split card of sorts. The first half of it is 2 colorless and 2 white mana for destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater on a sorcery. And then the second half has the Aftermath mechanic. Again, first time we're seeing this mechanic, so I'll explain it. This allows you to cast the card from your graveyard. And what this half of the card says is return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. This is an interesting card. Dusk is a board sweeper of sorts, but it is somewhat narrow since it only destroys creatures with power 3 or greater. There will be scenarios where this completely blows out your opponent, but there will also be scenarios where enough of their creatures survive that you don't feel great about it. That said, if you can take down 2 to 3 creatures with it, and hopefully none of your own, you'll feel pretty okay about the Dusk half. The Dawn half is some pretty nice value to have in your graveyard in the latter part of the game, as it allows you to return all your creatures with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. That's a great thing about all of these split cards. They provide a mana sink of sorts in the late game, so even if you are flooding out, you have something to spend your mana on if you cast Dusk earlier in the game. You could definitely try to build around this thing if you pick it up early, not getting a ton of creatures with 3 or more power, for instance, but I don't recommend it, since if you never draw this card, your opponent's larger creatures will put the hurt on you. Overall, I think both halves of this card are a little bit too narrow for it to be considered a bomb, or something I'm really excited to first pick. However, it is a good white card, and one I think most white decks would want to play, and I think I would feel okay about picking it up around pick 4 or 5, and I think that's about a B-. The next card we're looking at is Fanbearer. 1 white mana for a 1/2 zombie, and he has pay 2 generic mana and tap him to tap target creature. In addition to most sets having a pacifism, most sets also seem to have a Master Decoy, a card that is always good, and that's what we have here. The ability to tap creatures is pretty great, and means that this bearer is relevant at all stages of the game, whether as a small creature can attack early for a couple points of damage, or in the late game when he wreaks havoc on your opponent's creatures by tapping down their best attacker or blocker. It also gets an extra boost from having the zombie creature type, a creature type with a lot of support in this set, especially in the black-white color pair. This is one of the best white commons in the set, one that I think is even first pickable sometimes, and because of that, I think it's worth giving a B-. Next, we have Forsake the Worldly. 2 and a white for a card that says exile target artifact or enchantment, and it also has cycling for 2 generic mana. Now that we have left the plane of Kaladesh, cards capable of destroying artifacts and enchantments are no longer nearly as good in draft and aren't really main boardable. There are just not a ton of artifacts in this set. There are enchantments, but because there aren't enough artifacts for this card, it just isn't the best idea to main board it because you may not have targets for it. It does come with cycling, which boosts its stock a little bit. It means you can just throw it away and draw another card in the event that you don't have any targets for it, but this is still mostly a sideboard card. I think it gets a D- if you're mainboarding it, and a C when you side it in against an opponent who has enough targets. Next, we have Gideon of the Trials. For 1 generic mana and 2 white mana, you get a Planeswalker Gideon, who has 3 loyalty when he comes into play. His +1 loyalty ability is until your next turn, prevent all damage target permanent would deal. His 0 ability is until end of turn, Gideon of the Trials becomes a 4/4 human soldier creature with indestructible that's still a Planeswalker, prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. And his last ability is you get an emblem with, as long as you control a Gideon Planeswalker, you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. So because we haven't had enough good Gideons recently, they gave us a 3-drop one this time around, Gideon of the Trials. He's a pretty great card. He can protect himself to a degree, preventing damage from whatever your opponent's best permanent is, and he can do the usual Gideon thing of turning into an indestructible creature. Neither of those feel particularly unique or interesting for Gideon, though they are powerful, but his emblem ability is an interesting one. He makes it so you can't lose and your opponent can't win, so long as you control the Gideon Planeswalker. Now, there aren't a ton of spells that can outright kill Planeswalkers in this format, so that seems pretty good. However, it isn't incredible, as you could find yourself using that emblem right away, and your opponent finds a way to deal with them, and you get very little for your powerful Planeswalker. He's not the kind of Planeswalker that snowballs or anything either. Most get more powerful as the game goes on because they get so much more loyalty and have an amazing ultimate, and this Gideon just doesn't do that. He isn't the kind of Planeswalker who gets you back in the game from being behind, and that keeps him from being as strong as other Planeswalkers. He, a lot of the time, is just going to be a 4/4 beater, a mode you're going to be reluctant to use if you've used his emblem, since exile effects and -1/-1 counters can still kill him, indestructible or not, or a card that turns off the damage of your opponent's best permanent. With all that said, I think Gideon, while quite good, does not actually make it into the A range in Limited. He's going to be ridiculous and constructed, but because he's not good at all stages of the game, I don't feel like I can quite give him an A. He does get a B+ from me, though, which is about as close as you can get to an A, obviously. He's a great card, but he isn't game-breaking in the way other Planeswalkers are. He doesn't develop the board much, and the biggest thing he brings is the fact that he is basically a 3-mana 4/4. His emblem, while solid, is more fragile than it appears. There are certainly board states where playing Gideon basically just wins you the game, since your opponent can't find a way to touch him and the emblem means you win, basically. But there are plenty of other board states where Gideon just won't be able to do enough to keep himself alive, and because of that, he doesn't quite make it into the A range, as that type of card is typically a card, as I said, that is good on every sort of board state. All that said, I would still feel pretty great about first picking Gideon, especially because he's worth a ton of money, but there are several better options to first pick. Next, we have Gideon's Intervention. 2 colorless mana and 2 white mana for an enchantment that says, as Gideon's Intervention enters the battlefield, choose a card name. Your opponent can't cast spells with the chosen name. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and permanents you control by sources with the chosen name. Cards with only the first part of Gideon's Intervention, that is, the ability to keep an opponent from casting a named card, are usually pretty bad and limited. It's impossible to know what is best to name, or at least very close to it. However, the additional aspect of Gideon's Intervention, preventing all damage dealt to you and a permanence you control by sources of the chosen name, is pretty relevant, because you know what permanence your opponent has in play. You can actually make Gideon's Intervention do something. You can look at it as sort of a removal spell, because if you name a creature, that creature won't be able to effectively attack or block your creatures anymore. That said, most of the time I'd rather just have a straight-up removal spell, so Gideon's Intervention, while an interesting card, gets a C- from me because it isn't quite as good as a removal spell. A white deck should feel okay about playing it, but shouldn't exactly be pumped either. Next, we have Glory-Bound Initiate, who is 1 and a white for a 3/1 human warrior who has, you may exert Glory-Bound Initiate as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+3 and gains lifelink until end of turn. So as I said, as a mechanic, exert is somewhat hard to judge since we haven't seen something quite like it before. How much of a downside is it to have a creature not untap, and is what you get for it good enough? It is definitely a mechanic one has to play with to get a perfect feel for. All that said, this is a 2-mana 3/1, which on its own is a playable card, and on top of that, it can attack as a 4/4 with lifelink when you need it to. Gaining life is a good way of offsetting the fact that it won't untap on the next turn, but it still won't always be right to go for exerting. Sometimes you'll want the blocker on the next turn, or at least have the option. Still, a solid card any white deck would be happy to have in the 2-drop slot, but not one you should be taking super early, as while it is better than most of the 2-drops in the set, it isn't so much better than the other filler 2-drops that you should take it super early, and I give it a C+. Next, we have Gustwalker, who is 1 and a white mana for a 2/2 human wizard, and he says you may exert Gustwalker as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. Here we have another creature with Exert who does a good job on the vanilla test as a 2-mana 2/2. He doesn't have the most powerful of Exert abilities. Just getting in for 3 in the air isn't awesome, but it isn't bad either. Sometimes this will be the only creature you can attack with, and getting in for 3 in the air every other turn isn't too bad in a situation like that. That said, Gustwalker is nothing special. White decks will take him, but won't be particularly excited about it, and that is pretty much the classic description of a C. Next, we have Impeccable Timing. For 1 and a white mana, you have an instant, and it says Impeccable Timing deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. We just saw this card, and it was underwhelming. It is certainly a solid-ish playable card, but is the kind of removal you play begrudgingly because you didn't get better removal. The card is capable of killing blockers or attackers at least, but it is still situational. You have to have your opponent play into your hand for it to work, and cards like that often put you in awkward situations. Say you leave the mana up to kill your opponent's attacker instead of playing your 2-drop, and then your opponent just plays another creature and passes the turn. You've just fallen behind on board and left mana up for no reason. Similarly, if you attack and your opponent doesn't block the way you want them to, Impeccable Timing may not do anything. These aren't corner case situations with Impeccable Timing. These are things that happen to you at least once a draft if you drafted Impeccable Timing. It may turn out to be a little better in Amonkhet than it was in Kaladesh, but it will never be a premium removal spell. Don't seek this thing out. Take it if you see it late, and run it if you have to, but I think it's about a D+ because you'd rather have basically every other removal spell in white in the format. Next, we have Innoketra's Name. For 1 and a white mana, it's an instant, and it says zombies you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a pretty efficiently costed way to pump your whole board, and at instant speed, it can sort of be used as a combat trick. And this format does have lots of ways to go wide, and it also has lots of zombies, both things this wants from you. What's more is white, black, and blue have creatures who aren't zombies at first, but who have Embalm and can come back as zombies. It has the usual downside that this sort of card has, though. You need to have a good board for it to really be impactful. I only really see myself playing it in decks with 15+ creatures, with at least a few of those being zombies or creatures with Embalm. Those won't be things you have to work very hard to do in this format, though, so I think it makes Innoketra's Name into a perfectly solid playable, and it gets a solid C from me. If your deck is super zombie heavy, it can push into the C+ range, and I would feel pretty good about picking up one of these mid-pack. Next, we have Mighty Leap. 1 and a white mana for an instant that says target creature gets +2/+2 and gains flying until end of turn. I'm not super high on most combat tricks, but Mighty Leap is a solid one. It can win you the game out of nowhere once your opponent thinks they've finally stabilized on the ground, or it can come as a surprise to block your opponent's big scary flyer. The problem with Mighty Leap and combat tricks in general is that they open you up for 2-for-1s. So be very careful about what mana your opponent has untapped, and don't play into getting blown out unless you have no other choice. Gonna be a decent playable in an aggro deck, but no one else should want this. Because of how narrow it is, and because of the risk it brings when you cast it, and because it asks you to have a good creature to use it on, Mighty Leap can't quite get out of the D range for me, and I give it a D+, though I will say it gets closer to a C- in a good aggro deck, and I wouldn't be too unhappy to play it there. However, it will most likely wheel, so don't take it early. Next, we have Oketra the True. 3 colorless mana and 1 white mana for a legendary creature who is a god and is a 3/6 with double strike and indestructible. And it says Oketra the True can't attack or block unless you control at least 3 other creatures. And it says 3 and a white mana for create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with vigilance. This is the first of the gods we've looked at, and they're all pretty strong while having some really cool designs. Obviously, a 4 mana 3/6 with double strike and indestructible is insane, but Oketra will only be able to attack and block if you control at least 3 other creatures. That's not the hardest requirement to achieve, though, especially because Oketra, as well as the other gods, are capable of helping you reach the requirement to make them into an offensive force. Oketra's ability to generate a warrior creature token with vigilance every turn is actually already pretty solid, and provides a great late-game mana sink while also pulling you closer to having 3 other creatures and activating Oketra. Once you do, Oketra is pretty impossible to block effectively between double strike and indestructibility. Your opponent won't be able to trade with it, just chump block it. Oketra is also difficult to attack through, at least on the ground, as she can continue to pump out tokens while your opponent is unable to effectively attack you. There are, of course, other ways of dealing with Oketra, such as exile effects and -1/-1 counters, but this cat is very difficult to deal with once it is capable of attacking. All in all, I give this god an A-. It has a powerful mana sink, and not too steep of a requirement to make it into an attacker, and all of that is enough to make Oketra the kind of card I would be extremely happy to first pick in a draft. I do give it the minus, though, because it does ask you to jump through a few hoops. But luckily, those hoops aren't too hard to jump through, still keeping Oketra in the A range. Next, we have Oketra's Attendant, 3 colorless mana and 2 white mana for a 3/3 with flying and cycling. It also has Embalm for 3 colorless and 2 white mana. This card is a good use of the cycling mechanic because it has some interesting options. Before we get into that, though, how does Oketra's Attendant do on the vanilla test? Well, 5 mana for a 3/3 flyer. It's only about 1 mana more than I would normally want to play, and the fact that Oketra's Attendant comes with a reasonable Embalm cost means that this card is a solid playable. On top of that, though, this card is very flexible, and instead of casting it and waiting for it to die and then embalming it, you can cycle it in the earlier part of the game to dig deeper into your library for a land or removal or whatever, and then later in the game, embalm it out of your graveyard. Both courses of action with the card have their place, and both offer some pretty good value and basically amount to a 2-for-1. Thanks to the fact that Embalm and Cycling are the 2 most supported mechanics in this set, Oketra's Attendant also gets a little bit of a boost for having both of them. In the end, I think this card is about a B-. You probably don't want to be first picking it, but taking it around pick 4 or 5 seems pretty reasonable. Next, we have Protection of the Heckma. 4 generic mana and 1 white mana for an enchantment, and it says if a source an opponent controls would deal damage to you, prevent 1 of that damage. 5 mana for an enchantment that does nothing to affect the board is pretty ugly. Yes, it reduces damage done to you, which can sometimes be a powerful effect, but this is not a format loaded up with 1/1s that this just blanks. It is too slow to be good against the more aggressive decks in this format, and it won't be great against control decks that play big monsters at the end of the game who will kill you only a little less quickly with protection in play. This is the kind of card that I don't ever intend to play in this format, and because of that, I give it an F. Next, we have Regal Caracal. It's 3 colorless mana and 2 white mana for a cat who is a 3/3, and it says other cats you control get +1/+1 and have lifelink. It also says when Regal Caracal enters the battlefield, create 2/1/1 white cat creature tokens with lifelink. So she's a cat lord, and one who comes with a few of its own cats. The card is actually pretty nuts, as for 5 mana, you're getting 7 power and 7 toughness worth of stats, 4 of which has lifelink. Even if the Caracal is killed by a removal spell, the 2 tokens still hold on to lifelink, and that is an important thing to keep in mind, as it makes removal spells look pretty bad. Overall, this is incredible efficiency. What's more is the Caracal can pump your other cats too, and there are a decent number of those around in this set, but the fact that even on its own, the Caracal provides so many bodies with so much power and toughness is pretty great. This is the kind of card that is great no matter what the board state is. If you're behind, it buys you time with 3 blocking bodies, or it even pulls you into the lead. If you're at parity, it's definitely going to push you into the lead, and if you're ahead, it's going to put the nail in your opponent's coffin. This is a card I will be incredibly happy to first pick, and because of that, it gets an A. Next, we have Renewed Faith, which is an instant for 2 generic mana and 1 white, and it says you gain 6 life. It also has Cycling for 1 generic and a white, and it says when you cycle Renewed Faith, you may gain 2 life. Those of you who have been following my limited content for a while know that I disdain life gain for the sake of life gain. That is, cards that gain you life but don't do anything else. Usually they just aren't worth the mana or the card in limited, since your opponent will use their cards and their mana to develop their board while you are most likely just delaying the inevitable. Renewed Faith, though, is pretty good. It's something of a split card, and that adds some extra value to it that cards that don't do anything but gain you life don't have. You can look at it as an instant that gives you 6 life for 3 mana, or as an instant that gives you 2 life and draws you a card for 2 mana. The latter is usually going to be the better option, especially in a set with reasons to play cards with cycling. But occasionally the option to gain 6 life will be useful too, such as when it keeps you alive just long enough to win the game on the next turn. This card isn't incredible or anything, but I would play it in most white decks, though I wouldn't want to take it early or feel bad about passing it early, so that puts it into the C range. Next, we have Ret Crop Spearmaster. 2 generic and 1 white mana for a human warrior who is a 3/1, and it says, you may exert Ret Crop Spearmaster as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. This is an exert creature I'm a little less interested in. Doesn't do great on the vanilla test as a 3 mana 3/1, and its exert ability makes it into a formidable attacker certainly, but it doesn't give it evasion or anything. This is still a card that will make the cut most of the time in white decks, but I think it deserves a C- rather than a C, just because it isn't as good as most of the other exert creatures that we've talked about here. Next, we have Sacred Cat, who for 1 white mana is a cat creature that is a 1/1 that has lifelink and embalm for only 1 white mana. Sacred Cat isn't a card I'm going to be interested in playing most of the time. 1 mana, 1/1 lifelink is not enough for the card to be playable. That's a trap that people new to Limited often fall into. They see a 1 mana card that has some extra text on it, and they think that makes it solid, but the problem is how quickly 1 mana creatures get completely outclassed in Limited. This cat will be a glorified chump blocker 99% of the time. Basically, at every stage of the game, it's mediocre, and a card like that is hard to give anything more than a D. It is at its best in the early game where it can get in for a few, but in mid-game and later, it is pretty horrendous. It does come with a very reasonable Embalm cost, and in the event you end up in a deck that is super heavy with Embalm, the cat might inch towards a C, but in most decks, only play the Sacred Cat if you're desperate for playables. It just isn't normally going to be worth the card. Next, we have Seraph of the Suns, who for 5 generic mana and 2 white mana is an angel who's a 4/4 with flying and indestructible. Seraph of the Suns is a big indestructible flyer, and that's something many decks will be happy to have as a way to win the game in the long run. However, indestructible isn't quite as good as usual in this set. -1/-1 counters are everywhere, and there are also spells that exile creatures, which indestructible doesn't help with. Not all decks even want to be playing a 7-drop either, but if you're drafting a control deck and are low on big creatures to win you the game, you can do a lot worse than Seraph of the Suns. All that said, between the environment this card is in, coupled with the steep mana cost of this card, I think it only gets a C-. Not all white decks will want this card, but the ones that do want it will be pretty happy with it. Next, we have Sparring Mummy. 3 generic mana and 1 white mana for a 3/3 who says, when Sparring Mummy enters the battlefield, untap target creature. This card is super underwhelming. If I'm paying 4 mana for a 3/3, I usually expect it to do something sweet. Untapping a creature, while certainly something, isn't sweet. The Mummy does come with the useful zombie creature type, but I think this card is the kind of card that you only play when your draft goes wrong and you're short on playables. Though a deck loaded with zombie synergy might also be interested in this guy, I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have Supply Caravan, who for 4 generic mana and 1 white is a 3/5 camel that says, when Supply Caravan enters a battlefield, if you control a tapped creature, create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance. I like this card a decent amount. 5 mana for a 3/5 is the card's fail case, and while that would only give it a D or so, luckily that isn't all it does. Since, if you have a tapped creature, it makes a 1/1 warrior with Vigilance. Manufacturing situations where you have a tapped creature will not be very difficult. The simplest way for that to happen is for you to attack with a creature that survives combat, but this card has some more nuanced synergy to it. It works really well with Exert, since if you used Exert in your last combat on one of your creatures, it will be tapped, meaning that the camel will bring the warrior with it. All in all, I think the majority of the time you'll be able to get 4/6 worth of stats for 5 mana across 2 bodies, and making your board go a little wider. Both things that seem pretty solid to me, and get the Supply Caravan a C, meaning I feel pretty good picking it up around the middle of a pack and will play it in most white decks. Next, we have Ta Crop Elite, who for 3 generic mana and 1 white mana is a 2/2 bird warrior with flying, and it says, you may exert Ta Crop Elite as it attacks. When you do, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Ta Crop Elite is an Exert card I can get behind. For 4 mana, you get a 2/2 flyer, a little more than you would normally want to pay, certainly, but it also comes with a very powerful Exert option. The ability to pump your whole team, including itself, by +1/+1. We've already seen that there are plenty of ways to go wide in this format, and Ta Crop Elite is one of the payoffs for doing so. What makes the Elite so good is that you can choose whether or not to exert it. This means even if you don't quite have a board state where the +1/+1 thing is going to make a difference, you can still be getting in there with a 2/2 flyer until it is time for the Ta Crop Elite to do a little more work. This is true of all creatures with exert, of course. You have the option to not use it, but having it on an evasive creature makes it a lot better than we've seen on some of the other creatures. This card is solid in basically any white deck, especially one with 15+ creatures, and I think in a deck that has really gotten there on going wide, it creeps into the B- range, but I'm just going to give it a C here. Next, we have Those Who Serve, who for 2 generic and 1 white mana is a 2/4 zombie. That's it. This card does reasonably well in the vanilla test and has a useful creature type, but there are plenty of better things to be doing with 3 mana in this format. This is another mediocre filler card that you'll only play if you're short on playables in your colors, or thanks to its creature type if you have a ton of zombie synergy, but I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Time to Reflect, who for 1 colorless mana is an instant and says, exile target creature that blocked or was blocked by a zombie this turn. So this card is interesting, and also pretty narrow. If you're not playing zombies in your deck, it does stone nothing. That said, if you're in white, you've got at least a few zombies in your deck thanks to Embalm, but probably still not enough to warrant playing this. Because of the huge variance in the power level of this card, I'm going to give it 2 grades. In your average white limited deck, it is probably an unplayable F. But if you are either in the black-white color pair with access to tons of zombies or have a bunch of creatures with Embalm, the power level of this card, I think, creeps all the way up to a B-. It's super efficient, and while it also is situational, the sheer efficiency of a 1-mana removal spell, an exile spell at that, isn't something that can be taken lightly, though in most decks it is going to be an F, so keep that in mind. It's going to be the kind of card that will wheel. If you're drafting all the zombies, no one else is going to want it, and it'll be fine. It'll be good if you've got a lot of zombies, but otherwise not so much. So next we have Trial of Solidarity, who for 2 and a white mana is an enchantment and says when Trial of Solidarity enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +2/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. When a cartouche enters the battlefield under your control, return Trial of Solidarity to its owner's hand. And that's where the cartouche subtype comes into play, which we saw on the white cartouche. But Trial of Solidarity is another card that likes when you go wide. It pumps the whole team pretty efficiently while also bringing with it the Cartouche clause, which means you may find yourself able to use the ability more than once. The fact this card gives your whole team vigilance is very relevant. Not only does it mean that you can get in for some extra damage while not opening yourself up to a powerful swing from your opponent, it also synergizes really well with creatures who have Exert. The only thing creatures have to do to exert themselves is not untap until the next turn. Well, if they aren't tapped at all, this doesn't really matter, and Trial of Solidarity allows you to use Exert 2 turns in a row, basically. This card is solid in any creature-based deck where it gets a C+, but the more Exert you get, and the more cartouches you get, and the more ways of going wide you get, I think it does creep into the B range. Next up is Trueheart Duelist, who for 1 and a white mana is a human warrior who is a 2/2, and it says Trueheart Duelist can block an additional creature each combat. It also has Embalm for 2 generic and a white. If we just look at this card in terms of the vanilla test and the French vanilla test, it passes. For 2 mana, you have a 2/2 that can block more than one creature. This can come in handy when trying to lengthen the game and improve your chances in a race, and the Duelist has no problem jumping in front of 2 5/5s. Adding the Embalm mechanic to that is great because it means you get 2 cards out of 1 card, more or less, and the zombie token you make can also block additional creatures. In the early game, he's a nice 2-drop who can attack. In the later game, unlike the majority of 2-drops, he still brings value, and in 2 different ways. First, as mentioned, he can block more than one thing. Second, he can come back from your graveyard and do it again for 3 mana. 2-drops are always important and limited. It is usually imperative that you have a decent number of them, and this looks to me to be one of the better 2-drops in the set because it has such good value at all stages of the game. All of that means I have this guy at about a B-. I would be happy to have him in basically any white deck, and while he doesn't do anything game-breaking, he's good at every stage of the game. He doesn't quite reach B territory for me, though, as he isn't the kind of uncommon that I would generally want to be first picking. Next, we have Unwavering Initiate, who for 2 generic and 1 white mana is a 3/2 human warrior with vigilance, and Embalm for 4 generic and 1 white. This is another card with the Embalm mechanic, of course, and like many of the cards with it, he's pretty solid when it comes to the French vanilla test. A 3 mana 3/2 with vigilance on its own would probably be a filler card about a D+. However, the Initiate having Embalm pushes it over into the C range for the same reason many cards with Embalm get a power boost. It gives you 2 cards for only 1 card, and gives you something to do with your mana in the late game when you are flooding out. The Initiate's Embalm cost is pretty steep, but there are going to be tons of situations where you want to make the zombie token in the later part of the game. On the whole, the Initiate is a card I feel fine about having, one of in most of my white decks, but he isn't as good as some of the other Embalm creatures. He doesn't do excellent on the vanilla test, and he has a steep Embalm cost, so that's why he gets a C. Next, we have Vizier of Deferment, who for 2 generic and 1 white mana is a human cleric with flash, and it says, when Vizier of Deferment enters the battlefield, you may exile target creature if it attacked or blocked this turn. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. I like this card a lot just because of its sheer flexibility. You can use it for so many different things. Just to list a few of them, you can use it to blank an opponent's combat trick by exiling the creature they target it with. You can use it to help a creature dodge removal, assuming your opponent uses it during combat or after combat. You can use it to abuse and enter the battlefield trigger on your own creature. There will always be something for this Vizier to do, and most of it results in you getting something close to a 2-for-1 between the value of her enter the battlefield trigger and her 2/2 body, which can probably trade for something. All that said, she does limit herself to blinking attackers or blockers, but even with that limitation, she can easily do all of the things that I just listed, and because of that, I think he is deserving of a B-. I don't see why any white deck wouldn't want her and everything she has to offer, but don't take her too early. Pick 5 or 6 is probably about where you want her. Next, we have Vizier of Remedies, who for 1 generic and 1 white mana is a 2/1 human cleric who says, if 1 or more -1/-1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many -1/-1 counters -1, that's a lot of minuses, are put on it instead. A 2-mana 2/1 with upside is a card I feel solid about including in my deck, and the upside here is pretty real. -1/-1 counters are all over the place in this set, and Vizier of Remedies can help with that by weakening the cards that your opponent plays to put -1/-1 counters on your creature, or alternatively, strengthening creatures who come into play with -1/-1 counters on them. She's nothing special, but any white deck will play her, so I'm going to give her a C+. Next, we have Winged Shepherd, who for 5 colorless and 1 white mana is a 3/3 angel with flying and vigilance and cycling for 1 white mana. 6 mana for a 3/3 with flying and vigilance is about 1 mana more than I would be willing to pay for a card like this, and that alone would put this card in the D range. A card I only want to play if something goes wrong in my draft and I'm short on playables. However, it comes with a very efficient cycling cost, and putting cycling on a creature in the D range is generally going to be enough to push them into C range because they become so much more flexible. Sure, I can wait to cast this guy in the late game to help develop my board, but more often you'll find yourself cycling this away in the early game to help you find a land or get a trigger off of one of your abilities that likes it when you cycle. This flexibility is enough to get this guy into the okay playable range, giving it a C-. Well, that's the final white card in Amonkhet, Winged Shepherd. In the comments, let me know what you think of my ratings. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of my Amonkhet limited review, as well as limited reviews for future sets, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, I'll be back with my limited review for all the blue cards in Amonkhet, so I'll see you then. And my content is supported in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for Magic the Gathering content. One of the things that 5Color Combo is best known for is their sweet original playmats and tokens. Right now, they are running a Kickstarter campaign that helps fund new tokens, and you can actually receive tokens for your donation, including these really cool 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse zombie tokens that you see here. You can find more information about the Kickstarter in the description below. Thanks for watching.